Hey guys, tonight we're floating high above the Pacific Ocean, where the stars should be twinkling peacefully. But instead, the sky is about to tear open in a way it never has before. You're not standing in a war zone. You're not even near Earth's surface. You're tens of kilometers up, and something absolutely absurd is happening overhead. A nuclear bomb is about to explode in space. There's no countdown you can hear, no sirens, no dramatic movie-style tension, just stillness. And then, light. An overwhelming, pulsing bloom of white, then violet, then turquoise, spreading across the heavens like paint poured into water. It's not like anything you've ever seen, and you probably wouldn't survive it if you were any closer. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're listening from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's July 9th, 1962. You're standing somewhere in the Pacific, maybe on Johnston Island, a remote little coral speck turned secret military base. Or maybe you're in Hawaii, 900 miles away, sipping a soda on your porch just after sunset. It's about 11:00 p.m. local time, and the sky is unusually clear. You're told to expect something spectacular. Suddenly, the sky brightens with a light more radiant than the sun. For a moment, it looks like daylight has returned. Then the colors shift. Strange blues, deep reds, eerie greens, and arcs of light stretch across the atmosphere like cosmic jellyfish. People stare up, mouths open, kids scream, adults clap, radios crackle. You blink, but the afterimage clings to your eyes. This was Starfish Prime, a 1.4 megaton hydrogen bomb, 75 times more powerful than Hiroshima, detonated 250 miles above the Earth's surface. Not to stop a war, not even to test a weapon, but simply to see what would happen. You see, back in the late 50s and early 60s, the Cold War wasn't just about spying or missiles pointed at cities. It was about ideas, whose scientists were smarter, whose explosions were bigger, whose technology could reach farther, into space, into minds, into nature itself. The U.S. military had already tested nukes in deserts, underwater, even underground. But the sky? That was uncharted territory. What happens when you set off a thermonuclear bomb in space? Does it create a shockwave? Does it fry satellites? Does it make the atmosphere glow like a haunted disco? The truth is, nobody really knew. But that didn't stop them. Project Starfish Prime was part of something called Operation Fishbowl, a series of tests designed to explore nuclear effects at high altitude. The name Fishbowl was oddly poetic, considering the whole world was watching, and none of the fish were asked. Of course, from a scientific point of view, there were reasons. The UTIC wanted to understand the Van Allen radiation belts, the invisible donut-shaped zones of charged particles that wrap around Earth, discovered just a few years earlier. What would a nuclear explosion do to them? Could you blow a hole in them? Could you make a new one? Could you use a bomb to sweep radiation out of space, like a celestial Roomba? The military also wanted to study something more ominous, electromagnetic pulses, or EMPs. They suspected that detonating a bomb high in the atmosphere could knock out electronics on the ground, maybe even across an entire continent. In a world increasingly reliant on radios, radars, and early computers, that was a terrifying power to wield. But back to you. Standing under that sky, you wouldn't have known all that. What you'd know is this: the heavens just blinked like a strobe light, and your car radio suddenly died. Streetlights in Hawaii flickered out. Burglar alarms started ringing all over the islands. The city of Honolulu, briefly, felt like a ghost town invaded by color. Some people called it beautiful. Others were terrified. There were even reports of people thinking it was the second coming. To be fair, it's not every day the sky catches fire in technicolor silence. Here's the kicker. There had already been a Starfish test 2 months earlier. That one failed. The rocket misfired and had to be destroyed mid-air, scattering radioactive debris all over Johnston Island and the surrounding ocean. Engineers and soldiers spent weeks cleaning up glowing chunks of metal with long tongs and hazmat suits. And then, they tried again. Historians still argue whether the gamble was worth it. The visuals were undeniably stunning, but so were the risks. Radiation wasn't supposed to reach the surface, but it did, just a little. Satellites weren't supposed to die, but they did. A lot. Civilians weren't supposed to notice much, but thousands did, in ways no one had predicted. One quirky side note. The burst of light from the explosion was so intense that some security cameras at military bases hundreds of miles away were briefly burned out. In fact, a few film recordings of the test contain frames that just go pure white, as if the Earth blinked. It's oddly poetic. Humanity created a light so strong, even its own memory couldn't record it. This first section is only a taste. The sky cracked open like an egg that night. But that was just the beginning. What followed was a cascading chain of consequences that scientists hadn't expected, governments hadn't planned for, and nature, well, nature had some opinions of its own. Because when you nuke the sky just to see what happens, you're not just pushing boundaries, you're messing with systems that have been running smoothly since long before humans walked upright. And that, my sleepy friend, is where things start getting really weird. You're now stepping back a few years, into a meeting room thick with cigarette smoke, slide projectors humming, and men in uniform flipping through stacks of paper labeled Top Secret. It's 1958. The Cold War is in full swing. Paranoia is practically perfume. And somewhere in the bowels of the U.S. military-industrial complex, someone raises a hand and says, "What if we nuked space?" And nobody laughs. You're there as a quiet observer, an invisible presence sitting in the corner, watching generals and physicists sketch wild theories on chalkboards. The room is buzzing with energy. There's no script, just ambition. One guy's talking about stimulating the magnetosphere. Another's muttering about deterrence through spectacle. Everyone nods along like this is totally normal behavior for a Wednesday morning. At the center of it all, a concept that feels more science fiction than science. Project Argus. Before Starfish Prime, there was this lesser-known series of high-altitude nuclear tests launched from the South Atlantic in 1958. They were hush-hush, done in secret, and largely forgotten by the public. But they laid the groundwork. The Argus tests revealed that nuclear detonations could interact with Earth's magnetic field in strange ways, ways that opened up a whole new frontier of experimentation. Historians still argue whether those early results were inconclusive or terrifying enough to warrant a second try. Either way, they lit a fire under the labs at Los Alamos, Livermore, and beyond. From that seed of an idea grew Operation Fishbowl, a suite of high-altitude tests with names like Bluegill, Kingfish, and, of course, Starfish. These weren't hastily planned. You can almost see the diagrams: arcing missile trajectories, concentric blast radius maps, long-winded equations about ionospheric conductivity. It was the kind of over-planning you only get when the stakes are astronomical, literally. And yet, there was something almost childish about the idea, too. The scientists weren't just trying to win a war. Some of them, especially the younger ones, just wanted to know. What would happen if you detonated a thermonuclear device outside the atmosphere? Would it make auroras? Would it knock satellites out of orbit? Would it send radiation zooming along magnetic field lines like cosmic roller coasters? There were memos wondering if you could create a controlled artificial radiation belt, or clear space for safer orbital travel. That last one, in particular, aged poorly. Now, you might be wondering, weren't there any rules against this? Couldn't someone just say, hey, maybe don't explode nuclear bombs in space? In theory, yes. In practice, not so much. The Partial Test Ban Treaty, which would eventually prohibit nuclear explosions in space, was still a year away. In 1962, the sky was fair game. And so, the Yupsamasi got to work. The bomb itself, codenamed W-49, wasn't new. It had already been deployed in other tests. But this time, it would be riding atop a Thor missile, launched from a remote island in the middle of the Pacific. Think of the whole system as a firework engineered by people with far too much funding and far too few constraints. Now, picture yourself standing on Johnston Island in early July. It's brutally hot during the day. But at night, the stars are so clear, it's like someone scrubbed the sky. You can feel the tension in the air. Technicians double-checking launch codes, radios crackling, anti-contamination suits rustling like plastic ghosts. There's a kind of excitement you only get when doing something no one has ever done before, a quirky detail. The missile had to be launched from a modified launch pad assembled in near secrecy, surrounded by anti-aircraft guns, radar stations, and more concrete than most shopping malls. The US was genuinely worried that the Soviets might try to sabotage the mission. One rumor said a Soviet trawler had been spotted lurking near the test zone, because nothing says peaceful science experiment like a missile guarded like a dragon horde. And then there's the irony. While planning the Starfish prime detonation, U.S. scientists were increasingly worried about the test's side effects. One declassified memo worried the burst might create unforeseen damage to nearby orbits. Another warned about potential radiation exposure to military aircraft flying through the region. Yet the operation moved forward anyway. Why? Because in the 1960s, the frontier of science wasn't just about discovering natural laws, it was about owning them. Whoever understood space weapons first, it was believed, would own the next battlefield. And the idea that America could literally manipulate the sky, bend the magnetosphere, alter the ionosphere, light up the Earth's natural defenses like a Christmas tree, was too tempting to resist. The Soviet Union, for its part, wasn't blind to this. While the US was preparing Starfish Prime, the Soviets were testing their own high-altitude devices, notably one called Test 184, which would later be blamed for knocking out a power station in Kazakhstan. The arms race wasn't just about bigger bombs anymore. It was about weirder ones. One fringe tidbit? There were genuine discussions about whether it would be possible to weaponize the Earth's magnetic field. Some proposals theorized using repeated nuclear bursts to trap charged particles and direct them like a giant electric whip. Others speculated about creating a nuclear mirror in orbit that could reflect radiation beams. None of that worked, of course, but the fact that it was even discussed tells you where their heads were at. You're now caught in the strange intersection of science and spectacle. On the one hand, you've got equations, models, and anxious researchers trying to predict radiation decay curves. On the other, you've got top brass and government officials whispering about how the optics of a glowing sky over Hawaii might boost American morale and send a clear message to Moscow. And somewhere in between those worlds, someone gave the green light. One more missile, one more bomb, one more experiment with cosmic consequences. All because someone once asked, half seriously, what if we nuked the sky? You're standing on the edge of the launch pad, the salt wind biting at your face as floodlights spill over a hulking metallic cylinder aimed squarely at the stars. The Thor missile doesn't look especially graceful. It's more Cold War refrigerator than sleek spaceship, But what it lacks in beauty, it makes up for in sheer brute force. You glance up. The stars look oblivious to what's about to happen. This is the vehicle tasked with carrying the W-49 thermonuclear warhead to the edge of space. The Thor rocket, a repurposed ballistic missile from the early days of the U.S. arsenal, was chosen for its reliability, though that's generous. The first Starfish attempt in June had failed in spectacular fashion. The missile veered off course and had to be destroyed mid-air. The explosion scattered radioactive debris all over Johnston Island, contaminating parts of the runway, the jungle, and, quite possibly, several very unlucky seagulls. Cleanup crews in heavy suits worked in shifts for weeks, scooping glowing bits of rocket from the coral with metal tongs and burying them in drums. They called it a setback. You might call it a red flag. But in July, they tried again. July 9th, 1962, 11 p.m. You huddle with the launch crew behind reinforced bunkers as the countdown echoes across the base. Somewhere in a concrete command room, someone with a flat Midwestern accent begins ticking off final checks. Fuel pressure, gyroscope alignment, range safety protocols. Then it happens. The Thor missile ignites with a thunderous roar, drowning the world in a flood of noise and flame. The ground shakes. You feel it in your teeth. A massive plume of fire blasts downward as the missile lifts slowly, like it's changing its mind, and then gains speed as it cuts into the dark. You shield your eyes as the rocket becomes a pinprick of light, arcing higher, faster, trailing a comet tail of bright orange fury. It climbs past the stratosphere, into the mesosphere, brushing the edge of the thermosphere. Around 250 miles above Earth, the warhead reaches its programmed detonation altitude. Then silence. This is the weird thing about space nukes. There's no sound, no dramatic boom, no air to carry shockwaves, just a sudden, blinding light as if someone flipped a cosmic switch. The bomb detonates with the force of 1.4 megatons of TNT, roughly 100 Hiroshima bombs stacked together. But instead of leveling a city, it turns the sky into a science fiction nightmare. You're now in Hawaii, maybe sitting in a parked car with the radio playing Elvis Presley. The sky suddenly flashes white, brighter than the noon sun. The explosion produces a luminous hemisphere, expanding outward at astonishing speed. In less than a second, it stretches across hundreds of miles, a silent fireball glowing bluish-green, like the aurora borealis overdosed on caffeine. Everyone in Hawaii sees it. People on boats see it. Pilots in midair see it. Even parts of New Zealand catch glimpses of the eerie glow. You look up, and you feel something primal stir in your chest. Some combination of awe and dread that you didn't know your body was capable of. Within seconds, something stranger begins. The fireball fades, but the sky doesn't go back to normal. Instead, gigantic auroral bands unfurl, curved ribbons of red, pink, and teal twisting across the horizon like jellyfish tentacles. They don't behave like clouds. They dance, slowly, alien. Historians still argue whether the colors were enhanced by the Pacific humidity or whether the explosion fundamentally altered local atmospheric conditions. Either way, it didn't feel natural. It felt like Earth was wearing someone else's sky. The government told civilians it was a scientific experiment. One Hawaiian newspaper headline simply read, "Nuclear fireworks dazzle islanders." But not everyone was amused. You flick the car radio back on. Nothing. It's dead. So are the streetlights. Burglar alarms scream across the neighborhood. Garage doors, TV antennas, electric clocks, all glitch or fail outright. The bomb has unleashed an electromagnetic pulse, EMP, strong enough to short-circuit electrical systems across 1,000 kilometers. Even satellites orbiting Earth, some of them part of early weather and communications networks, begin to blink out. Not immediately, but within days. Many go dark, their sensitive circuits fried by a radiation wave they were never built to endure. One quirky footnote: a British satellite called Ariel 1, the UK's first space mission, launched just months earlier, was one of the first major victims. It wasn't supposed to be part of the test, but space doesn't care about your nationality. Back on Johnston Island, the launch team celebrates. You hear laughter echo across the airstrip, strange and brittle. Technicians shake hands, generals smile. After all, the mission was a success. The missile flew true. The bomb detonated cleanly. Data poured into servers and tape reels. In Cold War terms, that's a slam dunk. But a few feet away, a scientist stares quietly at the sky, jaw tense, notebook forgotten. Because what just happened wasn't controlled. Not really. They had modeled effects, yes. They had guessed at outcomes. But this was artless chaos painted across the heavens, glorious, but uncontrollable. And while they were cheering, the sky was still glowing. For nearly 7 minutes, Hawaii remained bathed in strange lights. Some described it as hauntingly beautiful, others as biblical. In the weeks that followed, residents would report radio static, delayed TV signals, and headaches. Some scientists quietly began whispering that maybe, just maybe, they had poked a hole in something they didn't fully understand. Meanwhile, kids on the islands drew glowing clouds in their school notebooks, and locals nicknamed the phenomenon the Night of the Rainbow Sky. It was an evening of firsts, the first major space-based nuclear detonation, the first real-world demonstration of an EMP over a populated area, and the first time humans had painted the sky with radioactive light. All of it carried on a rocket not much taller than a 4-story building. It rose on a pillar of fire, like a comet forged in bureaucracy and ambition. And when it vanished into the heavens, it took with it our sense that the atmosphere was somehow sacred or safe. Because from that night on, it became clear, if we could nuke that, we could nuke anything. You're still gazing up at the sky, but now the initial burst is over. The brilliant colors have begun to fade, but they aren't gone. Instead, the darkness above you pulses gently with strange aftershocks, ghostly glows, drifting bands of red and green light, and faint spirals that refuse to vanish. It's like the sky is bruised, and those bruises are spreading. You blink, rub your eyes, and glance around. You're not the only one confused. People across the Pacific are standing outside, silent. Some are pointing. Some are filming with clunky shoulder-mounted cameras. Some just stare. You're not witnessing a typical explosion's aftermath. There's no crater, no rubble, no debris raining down. Instead, something invisible has been unleashed. Something that's taken up residence in the very fabric of the sky. You start to feel uneasy, and not just because of the light show. Starfish Prime didn't create a shockwave or a mushroom cloud. The vacuum of space doesn't allow for such things. But it did generate something far stranger. A massive shell of high-energy particles. In simple terms, it injected raw radiation into Earth's magnetic field, and those particles didn't just disappear. They began to swirl, to gather, to linger. Welcome to the birth of a brand new radiation belt. This wasn't part of the original plan. Not exactly. Scientists had guessed that some particle enhancement might occur, but not on this scale. Instead of a brief flash of excitement, Starfish Prime had created a permanent problem. Electrons and protons, energized by the blast, were now trapped by Earth's magnetic field, and they were staying put. Imagine an invisible donut of radiation circling the planet, one that didn't exist before. One that humanity created with a single trigger pull. Historians still argue whether the size and strength of this artificial belt were anticipated, or if the planners had severely underestimated its persistence. But the effect was undeniable. Within days, Satellites that had worked perfectly before the test began to misbehave. You're floating now, up in orbit, drifting near one of these unfortunate machines. Ariel 1, Telstar, Transit 4B. They were marvels of their time, designed to test communications, study weather, help track ships. They represented the future. But suddenly, they're in trouble. Solar panels stop working, communication systems glitch, batteries die without warning. The satellites are being fried from the inside out, not all at once, but slowly, over weeks and months, like fruit left out in the sun. One fringe tidbit: some engineers tried to design emergency shielding retroactively, sending commands to adjust power flow or reroute circuits. But it was like sending umbrella instructions to someone already in a downpour. By the end of the year, at least 8 satellites were out of commission. And remember, this was 1962. The world didn't have a whole lot of spares floating up there. Back on Earth, researchers at the Los Alamos Scientific Laboratory began poring over the data. They realized the radiation shell created by Starfish Prime had significantly altered the Van Allen belts. The natural belts, discovered just a few years earlier by physicist James Van Allen, were zones of trapped particles shaped by Earth's magnetic field. They were delicate, dynamic, and essential. And now, they'd been given a steroid injection. You walk through a lab in New Mexico, late at night, where Van Allen himself sits at a desk, frowning at a series of confusing graphs. The instruments had recorded spikes in radiation, massive spikes, lasting much longer than anyone predicted. Weeks, not hours. Months, not days, one of Van Allen's colleagues reportedly muttered. "We broke it. We actually broke the sky. Of course, not in a literal sense. But the balance of things had shifted. The space just outside our world, once so sterile, so empty, was now behaving like a hazardous zone, a place full of crackling danger, a place that could no longer be considered safe for electronics or astronauts. Here's a particularly weird bit. The radiation belt was asymmetrical. Instead of forming a neat, tidy ring, it warped and bulged depending on the time of day, the Earth's magnetic field, and solar wind conditions. The result was a kind of radioactive jellyfish, tendrils reaching out unpredictably, licking the paths of passing spacecraft, and it stayed. The artificial belt didn't simply dissolve, it lingered for years, long enough to frustrate missions, sabotage experiments, and force engineers to rethink satellite design from the ground up. You might be wondering, did this radiation pose a risk to people? The answer is, maybe. The high-altitude detonation was far above commercial airspace, and the radiation didn't reach ground level in any concentrated form. But pilots flying at high altitudes during the days following the test may have been exposed to more than a casual dose. There were also weather balloons and test planes sent up by the US Air Force to gather samples. Some returned glowing slightly more than they left. No big deal, right? Just a little surprise souvenir from the upper atmosphere. Historians still argue whether these effects were responsibly monitored. Declassified reports hint that internal debates raged over the safety of follow-up tests. But publicly, the operation was deemed a success. Here's where it gets more unsettling. Starfish Prime created not just physical consequences, but strategic ones. Word spread quickly. The Soviet Union, already knee-deep in its own nuclear ambitions, took note. Reports suggest that Soviet scientists began drafting similar experiments, not for pure research, but for military potential. Could a high-altitude nuke be used as a weapon against communications infrastructure? Could it blind radars, cripple satellites, or shut down power grids? The answer, as the world would soon realize, was yes. But we're not quite there yet. For now, you're still watching the sky's aftershocks, rolling, pulsing, shimmering in slow motion. It's not just light, it's data, It's damage. It's the fingerprints of a new age, one where the final frontier just got its first scars. And you can't help but wonder, if we can wound the sky, how long before it wounds us back? You're lying back in the grass somewhere in Hawaii, maybe still processing what just happened the night before. The air is warm, the breeze soft, but the sky, it's different now. Not obviously, but subtly. You know when something's off, even if you can't put your finger on it. The stars don't seem quite right. The static on the radio won't stop. The glow that visited the sky hasn't entirely left your memory, or maybe it hasn't entirely left the sky. This isn't just a light show anymore, because Starfish Prime didn't end when the bomb went off. That was just the first domino. In the weeks following the detonation, reports started coming in from across the Pacific and beyond. Reports of weirdness. Let's start with the colors. You'd think the light would vanish after a few minutes, right? That once the flash faded, the atmosphere would return to normal. But for several hours after the detonation, people still reported strange glows on the horizon. Even the shape of the auroras was strange. Normally, auroras show up as long, dancing curtains. These looked more like stretched spirals or concentric rings. One observer described them as neon ripples leaking across the sky. Eloquent, creepy. Historians still argue whether these extended light effects were due solely to charged particles interacting with oxygen and nitrogen molecules, or if Starfish Prime had temporarily bent the ionosphere into a kaleidoscope. That's not poetic exaggeration. By the way, some fringe theories proposed that the detonation warped ionospheric layers in ways we didn't know were possible. Imagine the atmosphere getting a temporary migraine, complete with flashing lights. Now step back from Hawaii. What about further afield? In New Zealand. Amateur astronomers saw flickering arcs on their southern horizon. In Fiji, sailors reported a curtain of shifting green. And in Samoa, observers saw radio static jam their instruments, despite being over 1,000 miles away. The electromagnetic pulse had spread far wider than anyone expected. And here's the kicker. Some of these effects didn't happen immediately. They were delayed, hours, sometimes even days, which, naturally, made things extra confusing for the poor scientists who had to sort out cause from effect. There was no tidy explosion diagram, just chaos unfurling slowly in the upper atmosphere. You're now drifting above the Pacific, through a region known as the ionosphere, a layer of Earth's atmosphere charged with free electrons and ions, crucial for radio communications. It usually hums along just fine, bouncing signals over the curve of the Earth and enabling long-distance broadcasts. But after Starfish Prime, it's scrambled. Frequencies start failing. Communications between ships get spotty. Some bands are flooded with interference, others go eerily silent. And back in Hawaii, where the effects were most direct, electronic chaos reigns. Streetlights blinked out just after the detonation. Some never came back on. Burglar alarms triggered randomly. In Honolulu, a microwave communications relay station went down, forcing technicians to reroute emergency calls. Radios emitted a strange whine. It was as if every electrical device in the islands had caught a cold. One fringe detail? A few residents reported that fluorescent light tubes began to glow faintly on their own, even when disconnected. Like the very air had been charged. Imagine standing in your garage, holding a dead light bulb, and it starts to glow blue in your hand. Science? Maybe. Spooky? Definitely. EMPs, or electromagnetic pulses, weren't fully understood at the time. In fact, Starfish Prime is what taught us what a high-altitude detonation could do. When the bomb exploded 250 miles up, it generated a powerful EMP that spread across the Pacific like an invisible tidal wave. And unlike a traditional blast, which weakens with distance, this EMP actually intensified as it spread, thanks to its interaction with Earth's magnetic field. This led to something researchers began calling the radio horizon. Basically, If you were inside a certain distance from the blast, your electronics might be fine. But beyond that ring, say, around 1,000 kilometers out, where the EMP wave reinforced itself, that's where devices were most likely to fail. It made no intuitive sense, but the math worked. Sort of. You walk into a Department of Defense conference room a week later. Charts are everywhere. Engineers are arguing. Radios are still being tested. One guy is holding a melted circuit board like it's a dead pet. They hadn't expected this kind of fallout. There's also a darker realization setting in. If a single space nuke can knock out electronics across multiple islands, what happens if you detonate one over a city? That's the strategic shift. Starfish Prime began as a science experiment, a curiosity, but it became a blueprint for something more insidious. EMPs, it turned out, weren't just annoying, they were potentially crippling. Theories began flying. Space nukes could blind radar systems, disable missiles in mid-flight, disrupt an entire military communications grid, or worse, send civilian infrastructure into chaos. Historians still argue whether this realization spurred the US and Soviet militaries to develop EMP-specific war plans, or if they were already halfway there. Either way, Starfish Prime provided the proof. One bomb, one pulse, lights out. Meanwhile, the average person had no clue what had really happened. In Hawaii, newspapers celebrated the celestial spectacle. Kids wrote essays about the space fireworks. There was no mention of electromagnetic chaos, no word on the dead satellites, no warnings about radiation in orbit, and definitely no explanation to the people across the Pacific who also saw the sky burn, people who didn't ask to be part of the experiment, who weren't protected, who didn't even know the test was happening. But we'll get to them soon. For now, you lie under the sky, unsure if it's watching you back. The stars seem twitchier. The quiet hum of electronics doesn't sound quite right anymore. There's a kind of invisible tension in the air, because once you've lit up the sky with nuclear fire, you can't exactly turn it off. The countdown winds down to 0, and with a deep, thunderous roar, Starfish Prime erupts, an artificial sun blooming over Johnston Atoll in the still of night. You watch from afar as the darkness fractures, then disintegrates entirely. In less than a second, the pitch-black sky becomes a searing field of white-hot brilliance. For nearly 7 minutes, it's daylight again. But it's not warm or comforting daylight. It's something too sharp, too unnatural, something that doesn't belong. At 250 miles above Earth, the bomb unleashes a blast of 1.4 megatons, 70 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. And it wasn't even aimed at anyone. It was aimed at the sky. Within milliseconds, a brilliant fireball expands into a swirling green and red aurora, painting electromagnetic chaos across the upper atmosphere. From Hawaii, almost 900 miles away, stunned spectators can see the explosion light up the night, like some angry god cracking open the firmament. They don't know if it's a test or if World War III has just begun. You probably wouldn't survive this test if you were any closer, because this isn't just a light show. It's radiation, and it's hungry. The blast throws off a shockwave of high-energy electrons that interact with the Earth's magnetic field, stretching it, twisting it, snapping invisible magnetic lines like taut rubber bands. The result is a man-made radiation belt, a fiery trap of electrons swirling around the Earth. For hours, then days. This radiation clings stubbornly to the planet, much higher than the natural Van Allen belts, but far more dangerous. This new belt is, in a word, mean and totally unexpected. Physicist James Van Allen, yes, the guy the natural belts are named after, warned the U.S. government about this. He even helped design the instruments to measure the radiation. But when the data starts streaming in after the blast, even he's alarmed. The temporary radiation belt is far stronger than predicted. In fact, It threatens to fry anything that dares to pass through it. Satellites begin dying almost immediately. One of the first casualties? Telstar a shiny new communications satellite launched just a day after Starfish Prime. It had a promising future. This little sphere. It was supposed to bring satellite television and phone calls across the Atlantic. But its circuits begin to fail within weeks. Radiation from the artificial belt has cooked it alive. Historians still argue whether Telstar was the biggest casualty of the Starfish blast, or merely the first of many. Over the next few months, at least 8 satellites succumb. Others behave erratically, sending back gibberish or blinking out temporarily. These aren't wartime losses. They're victims of curiosity, and the world isn't ready for this side effect. Even the US military, which designed the test, is caught off guard, because it turns out that when you nuke the sky doesn't just sit there and take it. It fights back, on the ground. The electromagnetic pulse, EMP, rips through Hawaii with unexpected ferocity. 300 streetlights short out in an instant. Telephone systems fail. A burglar alarm goes off in a Honolulu business district, one of the few to survive, but there's no police response. Even in the early 60s, people quickly realize something is very wrong. But what exactly? You can imagine the government's reaction, a mix of triumph and panic. On one hand, Starfish Prime worked. Boy, did it work. On the other, it's as if they've opened a Pandora's box with wires, radiation, and global consequences. The global scientific community? Not thrilled? In the Soviet Union, scientists raise eyebrows and perhaps glasses of vodka in both fascination and concern. They're running similar tests themselves, of course, but they weren't expecting this level of fallout from someone else's experiment. European scientists, meanwhile, start murmuring about treaties and international oversight. It's hard to justify nuking the sky just to see what happens when what happens includes widespread satellite damage. Back in Hawaii, people debate whether the flash they saw was beautiful or terrifying. Newspapers print pictures of eerie, luminous clouds and glowing halos. Some call it science fiction made real. Others call it reckless. You're still there, walking slowly under a sky that's trying to return to normal, but hasn't quite. Stars flicker. Static crackles through radios. The atmosphere has been bruised, and up in orbit, a toxic, invisible trap now circles the globe, an unintended reminder of just how little we knew before lighting a fuse in the heavens. You settle into the afterglow of Starfish Prime. But afterglow doesn't quite do it justice. This isn't the quiet fade-out of a spent firework. It's more like an echo that won't die. In the days and weeks that follow, the sky still behaves oddly. The new radiation belt doesn't dissipate. It lingers. It pulses. It poisons. Scientists begin mapping this invisible menace, an artificial ring of radioactive particles swirling endlessly, high above the planet. It's like the Earth has grown a second, darker halo. And this isn't just a military nuisance. It's a hazard for every satellite and astronaut daring to travel through space. NASA, which was barely 4 years old at the time, finds its plans scrambled. Manned spaceflight missions are delayed or rerouted. Unmanned satellites need new shielding. Some never launch at all. The lesson is clear. Outer space has teeth, and sometimes they're your own fault. But perhaps the most unnerving consequence is what Starfish Prime revealed about Earth itself. You see, we always imagined the planet as a fortress, solid, grounded, immune to distant damage. But that test showed something else. That our magnetic field, so often invisible and unspoken, is actually a fragile lattice, a net of forces and flows that connects us all, delicate, interwoven, reactive. When the nuke went off, it didn't just damage hardware, it stirred the sky. It sang through the magnetic field, It made the Earth ring like a bell, and the echoes rolled through not just metal and wires, but through physics itself. Starfish Prime had turned the entire planet into an unwilling instrument. Governments took notice. Scientists, too. The test had exceeded expectations in all the wrong ways, and now the world had questions. How much higher could we go before we started peeling away the layers of our own atmosphere? Could we permanently deform the magnetosphere? Could future tests ignite chain reactions in space, triggering damage not just across the Earth, but across entire orbital zones? That wasn't a conspiracy theory. It was a genuine fear among physicists in the wake of Starfish Prime. The explosion's size and reach forced the WASH to pause and recalibrate. The entire nuclear testing program in space was questioned. Was this bold science or recklessness with an unlimited backdrop? Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, perhaps predictably, responded in kind, not to be outdone. They launched their own high-altitude nuclear tests, known as the K Project. One of them, known as Test 184, would unleash its own electromagnetic pulse over Kazakhstan, knocking out power and telephone systems across hundreds of miles. Like Starfish Prime, it was more than an explosion. It was a warning. By late 1962, world leaders had begun to rethink the game entirely. Because while nuking the ocean or a desert was horrifying enough, nuking space added a new layer of dread. You weren't just fighting your enemies, you were reshaping the invisible boundaries of Earth itself. In 1963, the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union signed the Partial Test Ban Treaty, banning nuclear explosions in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater. Underground testing would continue, of course, but the skies were off limits now. The heavens, once a tempting scientific playground, were finally declared too dangerous to tamper with. Starfish Prime helped write that decision into history. It became a silent teacher, a case study in cause and effect on a planetary scale, a reminder that science without limits can quickly become science without foresight. And yet, somewhere deep in military archives, you imagine, there are still papers, still blueprints, for high-altitude nuclear strategies. What if we detonated a bomb in space not for testing, but for defense? What if an enemy satellite had to be taken out? What's one artificial radiation belt compared to national security? The legacy of Starfish Prime is a paradox. It taught us how dangerous space nukes could be, and also showed how powerful they might become. You return now to those first moments when the sky lit up, the stars blinked out, and people in Hawaii stood still, wondering if it was sunrise or Judgment Day. The light has faded. The world has moved on, but somewhere above, in that vast stretch between Earth and the moon, the memory of that blast still lingers. Echoes of high-energy electrons trapped in invisible prisons, the ghosts of circuits and satellites sacrificed to curiosity. A sky that once caught fire and lived to tell about it. Out. And you? You drift off slowly, tucked beneath a roof, wrapped in layers of silence as the Earth spins on, still glowing faintly from that one night when we threw a sun into the stars, just to see what it would do. Good night. Sleep well. May your dreams be quiet and your skies remain still.